Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the final portion of the trial where we get to argue to you what we believe the facts in this case have shown throughout the course of this trial. First of all, I do know the sacrifices that y'all have given up to be here. And we have done our best effort to put together a case for you that is concise and it gets straight to the point, which is what I believe we have done here. When I stood up here in front of you on Tuesday, I told you what we were going to show in this case, and we have done every single thing that I told you that we were going to do. As we sat here on Tuesday, Quentin Verdell Tellis had a presumption of innocence that maintains or stays with him throughout the course of the trial, unless and until the state has proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt, but beyond a reasonable doubt that he is guilty of capital murder. That is what one of the instructions that Judge Chatham just read to you. And as I sat here on Tuesday talking with you, I told you how this trial was going to begin. And I told you as this trial began, you were going to think to yourself, why are we here? Because when the first responders got to Jessica, they did not hear the name Quentin. They heard what they thought was Eric or Derek. And I want to go through, and the way this works is I will talk to you for a little while, then I'm going to sit down, and the defense will have an opportunity to talk with you. And once they're finished, I will finally, because we carry the burden of proof in this case, the state does, that I will finally get to surmise or summarize to you the last portion of this trial. And then y'all's work begins. Our work is over with, and y'all's work has begun. And obviously everybody has watched, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate the attention that all of y'all have paid during the course of this trial, because I think each and every one of you understand just how important this trial is. Whenever anybody loses their life, whether it be here or whether it be in Pike County, whenever somebody loses their life, it becomes important. When this trial began, you heard from Lisa Chambers, Jessica's mother. And she told you a little bit about Jessica. She was 19 years old when she died. She had her whole life in front of her. You heard a little bit about her father, Ben, who worked out at the sheriff's department as a mechanic. What I call a blue-collar family. Hard workers. Just like all of us are. She was no different from any other 19-year-old that walks the streets today. Except for one thing. She isn't here anymore. And Lisa showed you a picture of Jessica. She was a beautiful blonde-haired girl. And we know that on the day that she died, that she got up around 9 o'clock. That she left the house. That she went and got with her friend Keisha. And the second witness that you heard in this trial was Keisha. And Keisha told you that they also picked up Quentin Tellis. Anything wrong with that? Absolutely not. We know for a fact that Keisha and Jessica were best friends. We also learned that Jessica had met Quentin some 2 weeks before. We know that they rode around that morning, that they smoked some weed. Jessica and Keisha did. And she did make some decisions as far as smoking marijuana that some of you may not approve of. But, you know, all 19-year-olds make mistakes. Do they deserve to die because of those mistakes? Absolutely not. But they rode around for a little while. And the interesting thing that comes out at this point is that Quentin, in his interviews with the Tim Douglas and Paul Rowlett, mentioned, we drove by where she was killed twice. So he knew the area. He knew where she died because they had gone by there twice earlier in the day. We also know that at some point around noon, they separated. They dropped Quentin off at his residence. And everything that I'm telling you folks here today is 100% backed up by either his words or the video or the cell phone data. We also know that she eventually at some point goes home and takes a nap. That Quentin hangs around his residence area, and that around 5 or 4:30 to 5 o'clock they begin talking again on the phone. And we also know that she left the house according to her mother, and that was the last time that Lisa ever saw her 19-year-old blonde-haired child alive. We know that she and Quentin were texting, "Where are you?" And we also know that earlier in the day, he had asked her for some loving. You've got the text messages. You can look at them. And we also know that for 4 consecutive days, he was asking her for sex. And for 4 consecutive days, she was rejecting him. It's in the text messages. You've got those. But I don't believe that Jessica ever foresaw Quentin as a threat. Because if you look at her responses when she's saying no, they're nice no's. They're not confrontational no's. But there's no doubt whatsoever that for 4 consecutive days he wanted sex with Jessica. So when the 5 o'clock hour rolls around and it starts turning into 5:30, the communication that he had on his mind was, I want some sex with you. I want some loving. And she said, oh Lord. And we know around 5:34 that she picked him up. And we know that around 6 o'clock they're at Batesville getting food. We know that at around 6:30 they're at a place According to him, they were in his driveway. The cell phone data, I believe Paul testified, shows it's just in that same area of his driveway, as well as that side road that y'all walked out to that day. If you remember, went up that little hill and went down in the big grassy area right there. Y'all were able to look just to your left and see Quentin's home. We know that at 7:26, some headlights pull out of that area. And if you'll remember, Paul did the fade from daylight to dark, so y'all will know exactly what area we're talking about. And that immediately Jessica's cell phone starts moving to the west. And the place where her car was set on fire was to the west. We know that 4 minutes later, 4 minutes, that her vehicle, or that she was at the site where she was killed. We know for a fact that the first responders were called at 8:09. And I'm sure when the defense does their closing, they're going to hit on the fact that we didn't take DNA samples from LaTroy Rudd or Glenn Williams. Judge Chatham, in his instructions, just told you, loud, plain, and clear, that you are allowed to use your common sense in reaching a verdict. And you heard Tim testify, you heard Tim Douglas, you heard Paul Rowlett testify, that these guys had absolutely nothing to do other than calling in and saying, we're seeing a fire. And Glenn told you, I thought it was an insurance job because it was close to Christmas. They didn't see a human being there. They called the fire in, which is what I think every single one of us would do if we're riding by a remote area and we see a car on fire. And Glenn also told you, look, I looked around for a minute to see if I saw anybody. Is there anything wrong with that? He never ever told y'all that he approached that car. And I think when y'all look at the photographs of the car, and you've also seen the car in the utter devastation that was done to that car, it's what I call the didn't do defense. And I'm quite confident that you're going to begin hearing when the defense does their closing argument what I call the didn't do defense. When you're faced with overwhelming evidence, you must shift the focus away from that overwhelming evidence to what law enforcement didn't do. And I surmise that if we had tested every single person down to the Mississippi Gulf Coast, the next question they might have asked was, well, did you go to Jamaica or the Cayman Islands or Mexico to test everybody down there? It's called the didn't do defense. Especially when you are faced with overwhelming evidence. And I also really anticipate, and I've anticipated this since day one. And that leads me to the next set of witnesses that you heard, which are all of the first responders. You heard from Seth Cook and Jody Morris and Cole Haley, who were the first three that were there. And Seth was the very first person to see Jessica. He said she was in the smoke, and as she was coming towards me, it looked like she was a zombie. Remember him saying that? She looked like a zombie. He said, I had never seen anything in my life like that. And then you hear from Cole Haley, and you saw the emotion that Cole was going through and the difficulty that he went through. Daniel Cole was emotional. There were other firefighters and first responders that made that scene that all told you, I will never ever forget what I saw. To a T, all of them said, I have never seen anybody like that in my life alive. But we know as more of them came, that they began to question her. And I don't know whether every single one of them leaned down and started to question Jessica. What I do know, and I want y'all to think about this for just a minute, because this was said by one of the firefighters, and I think it may have been Daniel Cole, that when they got there, Cole was talking to her. And then Daniel gets there. He's the big boss. And he's talking to Jessica, and he said when we first started talking, I couldn't understand what she's saying. It sounded like her name was Katrina, Courtney. Then finally I understood Jessica. And then he said, when he leaned down and said, who did this to you? He said, it sounded like Derek. And what I think is very telling, and I hope y'all remember this, is he turned around and said, hey, did everybody hear that? Did anybody hear that? She said Eric. So that word was getting out immediately of what she was saying. And then you go on to the other firefighters that say they heard the same thing. And then you get to Darrell House and Chuck Tucker from the Sheriff's Department who said they heard Eric or Derek. So when the investigation began, what do you logically think we were all focused on immensely? Eric or Derek? That makes common sense, doesn't it? And you heard two incredibly skilled investigators and intelligence analysts who told you, yeah, we were definitely looking at Eric or Derek. We went so far as to get the names of every single Eric or Derek in Panola County. And then you heard Paul testify that I even expanded it to all of the surrounding counties, including Lafayette, Yalobusha, Tallahatchie, Tate, Whitman, Coahoma. All of the counties that surround here, he expanded looking for Eric's or Derek's. So it's logical that's where we would be looking. But one thing that I want you to remember what Tim Douglas said was that when he was talking to the firefighters the next day, I believe it would have been that Tuesday, that one of them said, I couldn't understand what she said. It sounded like yombers. And when all the firefighters that were there, and you heard a couple of them testify, that all she kept saying was, I'm thirsty. I'm thirsty. Y'all remember saying that? She couldn't pronounce her T's. And you heard, which I think is one of the crucial witnesses in this case, is Dr. Hickerson. This is what he does for a living. He is a world-renowned burn specialist. And y'all remember what he told y'all. That you can't put a lot of stock into what she was saying because her ability to communicate was severely affected. Severely affected. And you will have the photographs back there with you, and I know they are horrific. They are absolutely horrific. Y'all have seen some of them. But I really would like for y'all to take a close look at the exhibit where you see her mouth and her face. And you will see what Mary Beth Hall told you about when she first got to the emergency room at the Regional 1 in Memphis. And there wasn't anything we could do for her. And that will be supported by what Dr. Hickerson said, the photographs of the state of her mouth. You heard Dr. Barnhart, and you've actually got a photograph of her larynx, her throat, that was cut open so you could actually see the amount of soot that was down in her throat and all of the redness that Dr. Barnhart testified that was in her throat. All of that is incredibly consistent with a young girl who had inhaled very, and I believe Mary Beth said it, extremely hot gases. Extremely hot gases. And I'm not trying to take away from what the firefighters said they heard, because that is what it is. But as we began to look, and Tim told you this, we could not limit ourselves just to what she said. We had to keep an open mind about this investigation. Y'all remember Tim saying that yesterday? Which is what we did. We kept an extremely open mind, focusing obviously on all of the Erics or the Derricks. And Paul told you about the extent that we went to locate the Erics and the Derricks. Even one of them we spent 4 days trying to include or exclude. And one of the things that was extremely important, I think, that Paul said yesterday, was that not only are we here to include people, but we're here to exclude people. You remember him saying that yesterday? He said that. So when we were working on the Erics and the Derricks, it was our responsibility to either include an Eric and a Derrick or to exclude an Eric or a Derrick. And a tremendous amount of time was spent on doing that. You heard both of these men testify to that. But there was nothing there. There were 2 people on her Facebook friends, which I believe he testified that in her phone she had over 100 friends. Remember him saying that? And 2 of them were Eric, and he said that one of them was eliminated immediately. The second one, they were able to obtain his phone data and Jessica's phone data, and Paul testified to you to the extent that he went to the inner layer, the outer layer, and a third layer out. That he ended up with over 20,000 phone numbers and contacts that we could all reference back every time a suspect came upon us. 20,000 phone numbers, that's a whole lot. That's a whole lot of data that we have at our disposal. And it came from the Fusion Center. It came from Jessica's contacts. It came from every single person that we came in contact with. We expanded out so far to include multiple counties. No Erics or Derricks. She had none in her phone. You look at all of her text messages on the day that she died. Not a single contact with an Eric or a Derrick. Quentin told you in the interview that she was supposed to leave his house at 7 o'clock to go meet someone else. Remember him saying that? No one left the house at 7 o'clock. The 7:10 was when someone left, and that was his Uncle Sam. She never made contact with anyone other than Quentin Tellis except for a 6:48 phone call that she had with her mother. There was no Eric or Derrick that she was in contact with. So when the investigators began to look at all of the information that was being brought into us, and it was a tremendous amount of information. 756 pages on Jessica's phone alone. On Jessica's phone alone. All that information had to be disseminated and looked at and investigated. I believe Paul told you at one point during the investigation there were over 60 investigators in the room at the same time. All of these leads, as you've been told, were being followed. And it just ended up with nowhere. Tim told you of trips to Iowa, trips to Tennessee, following leads that we were given that all ended up with nothing. And once we finished with what the firefighters had told us, and we had looked at all of the Erics or the Derricks, because it was extremely important to us to look at that. We also looked at everybody that she had been in contact with. And one of the people in her phone was Quentin Tellis. Thank you. One of the people was Quentin Tellis. So he was interviewed 4 days after Jessica died. 3 days after she died, actually. It was the 7th she died. He was interviewed on the 10th. He said, yeah, I was with her that morning, but I never saw her after noon. He said, that I thought that I had, or something to the effect is, yeah, I went over and threw some money in her car. Remember him saying that? But Paul showed him that occurred on Friday. But he was adamant, and you watch the interviews, he was adamant that he had seen her, that's the only time he had seen her that afternoon. Not ridden around with her, not communicated with her. Just didn't happen. Except for 2:30 when he started asking her for sex. Then the FBI interviews him 8 days later. And they actually go to his house. And he tells them, yeah, I've known Jessica. Yeah, I was with her that morning. I did not see her that afternoon. Oh, and by the way, we had sex right over here next to my house. And when I got over in the passenger, or when she got over in the passenger seat, we laid the seat back. Remember him telling the FBI that? We laid the seat back. At the time, that didn't mean anything to us. On the 18th, it did. And then he tells the FBI what I think is one of the most telling things in this whole case. Is they were up by the shed at the front of his house, and y'all all saw the shed at the front of his house. And what did he tell the FBI? And he pointed this out to them, because if you heard Dustin testify, we didn't ask him about the gas. We asked him how he got around. And he said, I got my dirt bike. Oh, and by the way, I've got a 5-gallon jug of gasoline back in the back of the shed. Remember Dustin telling you he said that? Tells them where he had sex with the seat laid back. And then he tells them, oh yeah, I've got a 5-gallon gallon jug of gasoline sitting right here in my shed. And I think all of you know where I'm going with this, because you're going to know that's going to come important later on. And at this point, the investigation, after we've looked at all the Erics and Derricks, and we've looked through everything, the officers have made trips to Iowa, made trips to Tennessee following leads. That nothing panned out. You heard Paul testify that beginning in October of 2015, a decision was made to start looking at the data again. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to conclude the first portion of my closing with right now. The defense will have an opportunity to speak to you, and then I'll finish my closing.